Maple syrup making seems intimidating, but the truth is you only need a few things and 1 or 2 decent-sized maple trees, and they don't even have to be sugar maples. We tap just 2 trees every year, each tree with 2 taps, and we average collecting about 50 gallons of sap over a 2 to 3 week period. For us, this yields around 2 entire gallons of maple syrup. And the trees we tap are autumn blaze maples, which are a cross between a red and silver maple. When the ground is still frozen and it's too cold to do most other outdoor projects, maple syruping is the perfect activity to welcome in spring. Now, the common statistic you'll see is that it takes 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. This isn't a hard and fast rule, though. We often end up with a much better ratio than that. I think this is because our 2 maple trees have gigantic canopies, which means lots of photosynthesis and plenty of space for them to sprawl out. Any type of maple can be tapped for syrup, even box elder. Of course, sugar maples are recommended because they typically have richer sap, which translates to less work and more finished syrup for you. You know, we eat a lot of homegrown food, but there's just something extra special about making your own maple syrup. This is something anyone can do in their backyard, and I'm going to show you our very cobbled together but successful way of doing it. In order to safely tap a tree, it should be at least 10 inches in diameter at about 4 feet up the trunk. It's usually easier to measure circumference though, so Carl uses a tape measure to check. And I'll put the measurements in the video description below so you know how many taps a tree can have. Depending on the size, it's either 1, 2, or 3. 3 is the most taps a tree can have. Our trees are big enough to have 2. The sap will flow when the daytime temperature rises above freezing, but the nights still fall below freezing. The exact dates of when to tap will depend on where you live and also the weather that year. Just like any crop, you'll have good years and bad years. There is a little bit of an art that goes along with this science, an art in reading and anticipating the weather and your specific microclimate, because once you drill a hole in the tree, you have about a 4-week window before the hole will start to close and essentially start to heal. Now, if you tap too early, you may miss a good later run, and if you tap too late, you may miss a good early sap run. And you should absolutely not re-drill a hole. You get 1 shot to tap it, and this is, of course, for the well-being of the tree. The only specialized equipment you need for tapping is the actual taps, or spiles, as us syrupers call them. Everything else you may already have laying around the garage, like a drill and a drill bit, and a hammer and a block of wood. There are a couple of different sizes of spiles available, so make sure to use the correct drill bit for the size that you have. The standard size, the most common size, is 7/16, and we actually use a 1/2-inch drill bit, which seems to work well for our taps. Collection buckets can be anything. We love these old-fashioned metal buckets with lids. I will link them below, but you can use the newfangled plastic bags or a plastic bucket on the ground with a tube running into it, or even recycled plastic juice bottles with holes cut into them. You want to let the spile tell you how deep to drill the hole. We wrap a piece of masking tape around the bit so we drill exactly to the right depth, which is usually around 2 inches. Tap the tree at a height that is convenient. We find like 3 to 4 feet off the ground to be best, and try to pick a location above a big root or below a big branch, as these tend to produce the best. And avoid anywhere with a big knot, and don't place a tap in an area of the tree that is damaged or close to a tap hole from the previous year. We usually look for somewhere on the southern side of the tree because the sun does help with sap flow, and the hole should be drilled at a very slight upward angle because, well, gravity. Just stick the spile into the hole. We like to use a wood block to drive the spile into the tree so that we don't totally mangle it because it does take a little bit of force. It should be snug and not come out easily when tugged on. And if the sap is running, it will immediately start dripping out the tap, so be ready and get your bucket underneath it. I like this bucket and spile system because you can see here it's just really easy to use. The buckets have little holes that hang right on the taps, and then the lid covers them up. These buckets are 2 gallons, and we check them every single day and sometimes twice a day when the sap is really flowing. The amount of sap we get varies every day, but it's not uncommon to get 2 or 3 gallons of sap from 1 tap in a 24-hour period. So make sure to check them often so that you don't waste a single drop. Here's a great example of why I like to use something with a lid. There's a lot of debris that falls from the tree this time of year, and all of that would have otherwise ended up in my sap bucket. As far as sap storage, you can use a lot of different things to store maple sap. Just make sure that it's food grade and it can be closed. We really like these 3.5 or 4-gallon plastic buckets with lids, which we have gotten for cheap at the grocery store bakery department. They usually hold frosting. And we pour the sap right into them from the collection buckets. They're easy to move around, they're easy to store, and the lids are very snug so they keep critters out, like insects, rodents, and, chickens, apparently. Sap is alive, and it's helpful to think of it more like milk than water. Because it needs to be kept cold, we keep these buckets stored outside on the north side of our house where the sun doesn't shine. And if we have enough snow, which some years we do and some years we don't, we bury the buckets of sap in the snowbank as we collect them every day, and this allows us to store them for up to 2 weeks. If you can't keep the sap super, super cold, like refrigerator temp cold, you'll need to boil it sooner and more often. You know, if there isn't any snow for us to make a really cool maple sap snow fort like this, we will boil what we've collected every week. If it gets really hot out all of a sudden, the sap won't store for more than a few days, but chances are that if the temps are good for the sap to be running in the first place, you should be able to keep your sap for a week before it starts to ferment and go bad. And if you have room in a freezer, you can store it in there too. Okay, 2 small details. If it's going to rain or snow, collect your sap just before it starts. Even with these lids, precipitation will often still get in the buckets, which dilutes things and also doesn't taste good. So we always end up dumping whatever's in the bucket after a storm. It's time to stop collecting sap when the tree buds start to swell. These right here are dormant buds. These have not started to swell yet. And if this is new to you, make sure to look at them. Make sure to take photos so you can tell when they do start to swell. If you collect sap late after the tree has broken dormancy, it can get a bitter flavor. It is maple boiling day. Well, actually, let me back up. Sometimes your sap will be frozen solid if it gets really cold out. This is the case this year, so 2 days before boiling, we dug the buckets out of the snowbank and brought them inside to thaw. Much to our dog's delight, he thinks the melted snow on top of the buckets is his personal water dish. And if they're not frozen, if your buckets are not frozen solid, of course, you don't have to worry about this. Okay, now it's Maple Day. We boil over an open fire, and this setup works pretty slick. These are some old concrete silo staves holding up some heavy-duty metal fence posts that are holding up some old oven and grill grates. You know, sometimes it pays to keep a well-stocked junk pile on your homestead. We like this because it's a sturdy surface that won't shift as the fire burns. The oven grates aren't totally necessary, but they do help with stability. And this is a fairly big setup we have now. When we first started syruping, we only had 3 pans, and now we've graduated to running 8 pans. There are a lot of different ways to boil maple syrup, but we prefer to do it over fire. It's an enjoyable activity on a spring day, and wood is an available resource here. Many people will make a small rocket stove setup, usually a metal drum with a hole cut out of it, for 1 or 2 large buffet pans. Some use a propane burner. You can get creative with what you have. We made maple syrup for 10 years with no special equipment before we bought a set of 6 stainless steel buffet pans. See, old junk again, which I kind of love that. It was a backwoods setup for sure. Really it still is. We used old Nesco roaster inserts. Those are the black pans there that Carl's filling right now. We still use those. And we used to use large enamel canning pots as well, which we've now retired. Once the fire is hot, Carl puts a couple pans on at a time and fills them up. You wouldn't want to keep dry pans on the fire for any longer than a few seconds. And surface area is your friend, so wider, shallower pans are the best. I'll link these stainless steel ones below. They were actually pretty affordable, and we really, really like them. The more pans you use, the faster the boiling will get done. And if all you have is 1 pan, that's okay too, but you will enjoy a nice, long, relaxing day out by the fire. So bring some marshmallows. Just don't boil maple syrup inside your house. It's okay to finish it inside, just not boil it all the way down inside, as it can make your walls and everything sticky, or so I've heard anyways. Learning to do the sap shuffle, as we call it. As the sap evaporates and becomes more concentrated, we will start to combine pans so that we can keep adding new sap and keep things rolling. And like always goes with like. Don't pour new sap into a pan that has almost syrup in it. Instead, combine pans that are of similar doneness and add the new sap to an empty pan. And be careful when you do this, it's obviously very hot. We use heavy-duty oven mitts or sometimes even welding gloves. Let me talk about the sap shuffle a little bit more. So Carl always starts with fresh sap in all of the pans, of course. And once those boil down, he combines them all together in 2 pans. That opens up a lot of pans for fresh sap. So he fills those with fresh sap again, and then once those boil down, he combines those ones. And by the time those boil down, the original ones he combined are ready to go in the off pan. We'll talk about the off pan in a second here. He keeps cycling through the sap like this until it's all on the fire. The goal is to get as much sap on the fire and as hot as possible for as long as possible to keep the evaporation maximized. If you are only working with 1 or 2 pans, you should let it boil from fresh sap to almost syrup and then pour it into your off pan. Start over with fresh sap again and repeat the process until you work through all of your sap. One word of caution, sometimes when it's vigorously boiling, all of a sudden it'll start to foam up, and we use a long-handled spider strainer to skim the foam. Otherwise, it keeps boiling over and you'll lose sap. Which, by the way, this is just a simulation. This isn't actually what it looks like when it happens. Sorry, I couldn't capture that on video. But if you're getting this a lot or often, you might have your fire just a little too hot. We use maple boiling as a nice time to relax in nature and sit by the fire and soak up the sun and putter around the yard. The fire, though, and the boiling sap should be watched carefully. Definitely don't go out of eyeshot from it, but do feel free to make the most of your time when you're outside. You've officially made maple syrup when it's 7.5 degrees above the boiling point of water, which for us is 219.5 degrees. Of course, you'll want to adjust this for your elevation. It is difficult to bring maple syrup to the exact correct finish temperature over an open fire, so we do the last part in the house on the stove where there's a lot more control. We've done this enough now that we just go by color and what it looks like, kind of like this. But if you want a temperature, I'd take it off the heat when it's around 5 degrees shy of your maple syrup target. It'll be darker in color like this, but it'll still have the consistency of water. Okay, the off pan. We keep one of my big soup pots out next to the fire and we pour the almost syrup in it as it becomes done. Once a pan is close to syrup, Carl pours it in and we keep adding to it all day. And this is what comes in the house to be finished on the stove. And maple syruping is a lot of fun, but it gets to be a bit of a long day when you do this much at one time. So it's always a great feeling when you're down to the last few pans. Don't forget to pop out your taps as soon as you decide not to collect any more sap so that the tree can heal. Oh, and one more tip. Don't forget to hunt for sapsicles. You can do this even if you aren't tapping trees. This is where the sap drips from a small wound on the tree and it freezes at night or when it's cold. My very favorite treat. They are slightly sweet and they're incredibly refreshing and just fun to find. Now, the second leg of the race. Carl is in charge of the outside boiling and I am the finisher. And we like to make this a 2-day process. So what you're looking at here is the off pan, which we brought in and has been sitting on the stove cooling overnight. At this stage, I call it almost syrup because it's really, really close, but not quite. And you can see it's a bit watery yet. It will have debris and sediment that needs to be filtered out. And a lot of people filter once the syrup is finished, but I prefer to filter it in this stage. It just makes more sense to me, and here's why. We're usually tired from boiling outside all day, and this is a nice natural break point anyways. Because this is cooled, it's safer to filter, and most of the gunk that you want to filter out is now settled very nicely at the bottom of the pot. Here are the filters. They're actually made for maple syruping, and they're very similar to filters that are used for filtering cooking oil. They feel like a thick coffee filter or like some kind of hybrid between paper and cloth. For many years, though, before I got these, I just used a clean kitchen tea towel, and that worked fine, although I will say these do work much better. Okay, I'm getting to the bottom of the off pan here, and I'm being very careful not to disturb the sediment that's at the bottom. And I want to show you this. This is something I learned after a lot of experience. Here's what the filter looks like after filtering the bulk of the almost syrup. Look at all of that. But that's actually nothing compared to what's left in the bottom of the pot. It's kind of a sludge, and I'm pouring it into this bowl so I can show you what it looks like. You can try to filter this, but a lot of it will go through the filter and cloud up your beautiful clear syrup, even with a good filter like this. Here's what the filter looks like after most of that went through. Instead of filtering this sludge stuff from the bottom of the pot, I just toss it. But that's up to you. If you don't boil over an open fire, it likely won't be this bad. And by the way, these filters are reusable. They rinse right out and you can use them over and over. I've been using this one for like 3 or 4 years now. I've got my beautiful, clear, almost syrup here ready to finish. And we're starting around 214, so we've got a ways to go here. My goal is 219.5, and I want to make sure that it's a solid 219.5, so I usually boil it until I see the thermometer start to flirt with 220. If you go short of your target temperature, there will be too much water and your syrup can mold. And if you take it too far past this point, your syrup can crystallize. So we're really looking for an exact Goldilocks temperature here, and how long this last part takes really depends on how much you have and how watery it still is yet. I expect that this will take between 1 and 2 hours for what I have here. How do you store maple syrup? Well, if you only have a small amount, you can just put it in a jar and stick it in the fridge. If you have a larger amount or want to store it for a longer time, maple syrup can be canned or frozen. There is some mixed information out there on canning maple syrup. Some say that it causes it to become darker and that it's just not necessary. Well, I've been making and canning maple syrup for 12 years now, and I have never found canning to affect the quality. And we put up a lot of syrup every year, usually around 2 gallons, and it's very precious stuff, as you've probably gathered by now from the amount of work that goes into it. And I like the added insurance and the peace of mind knowing it's very shelf stable in these jars. I use a steam canner, but you can also use a water bath canner, and I can both quarts and pints for 10 minutes. Some people recommend open kettle canning, which is when you just pour the hot boiling syrup into hot sterilized jars and screw on the lids. And I have done it this way on occasion, but I much prefer to actually run it through the canner. And that's it. Congrats, you've made maple syrup. And I bet you a pancake, it's the best maple syrup you've ever tasted. I really want to encourage you to give this a try if you have access to maple trees. It is so rewarding. As always, let me know if you have any questions. There are resources linked in the show notes, and if you found this video helpful, I would love it if you could give it a thumbs up. And make sure to subscribe to my channel so that you are the first to know whenever a new video is posted.